I want to thank Maccabi USA for giving me this opportunity to present my information about my book. Specifically, I'd like to thank Debbie because she's the one, I think, who coordinated the book club, Debbie Adams, and Shane and Mackenzie and Dan and everybody that's involved, and definitely everybody who is tuning into this presentation. So I'm going to begin by telling you that the concept for me to write this book came about, I think about 10 years ago. It was my mother's yard site. My mother passed away in 2004. So I'm sure you're all familiar with doing a kiddush for a yard site. Usually it's done in a synagogue. There's a reception. There's different types of ways of doing it. I did it in my house, which was a couple of blocks away from my shul. Shabbos afternoon, everybody walked over, and I did a lot of dishes. I self-catered, and the dishes that I presented were things that I learned from my mother. And my mother used to tell me, as I grew up, that she told me all about her Auschwitz experiences. My father did also, and my mother used to tell me that when she was in Auschwitz, she spent a lot of time cooking. So I could never understand, what do you mean cooking? I heard that there was no food there, that there was starvation. So she told me that she used to spend the time with the other Hungarian ladies, and they used to talk about how they made various dishes when they were home. How did they, what kind of a tablecloth they would set up on their table, who would come to these festive meals, the different meal for Sukkot, for different meal for Rosh Hashanah, so on and so forth. And as the years passed, she wrote down these recipes, and I learned to cook from her, and she wrote down the recipes, and I learned to be able to do them. So when I had this kiddush, this was like, I think, the first or second year, actually, after my mother passed away. So I invited everybody, and I gave them a little bit of a background to all of my friends from shul about my mother, who she was. I had pictures of my mother all over. And I mentioned to them that the food that they're going to eat are made from recipes that my mother learned in Auschwitz. And then I told everybody, please enjoy the recipes from Auschwitz. I never thought about this title. And a couple of people came over to me after the kiddush and said, wow, you know, I think maybe you should write it down. Maybe you should write these recipes down. You should write your mother's story down. So that's how the idea came to me to, write the story down. Although my mother has told me many times that she was interested in me writing the story of what happened to her, but to call it Recipes from Auschwitz came from this particular experience. So now that I have done that introduction, here we go. I'm good. Everybody sees it good. Fantastic. So the name of the book is Recipes from Auschwitz. Several people have told me that it's a misnomer, that they think that it's actually a cookbook. It has 24 recipes in it. It's by far not a cookbook. I used the format of the recipes to tell her story. And while I was writing her story, I decided that I should also include my father's story. So this is what the book is basically about. It's about the survival of two Hungarian Jews with historical insight. Through the eyes of my parents and their experiences, I'm able to tell the story of the entire Hungarian Jewish experience in Auschwitz. As you will see as I get into it, all of the Jews in Hungary fell into two areas. One was Budapest, the capital, and about 500, 600,000 Jews lived in provinces, all outside of Budapest. And all of their stories from the provinces were pretty much exactly the same. The reason it was so incredibly similar is because in the history of the Holocaust, the Hungarian experience was the one where they did it in a second. It took 7 weeks to ship away almost 600,000 Jews to Auschwitz. 7 weeks. And Eichmann, who was in charge of leading the deportation, came to Hungary with 150 staff. So obviously, he had a lot of help from somebody, and the help that he got was from the Hungarians. So, okay. We're going to talk a little bit about the church and how church fostered anti-Semitism, a little history of Hungarian Jewry. The Tisza Eszla blood libel is very important in Hungarian Jewish history. A little bit about political anti-Semitism, about my mother and father, and the story of the deportation and the destruction of Hungarian Jewry, and Hungary's effort to sanitize their role in this destruction. So early on, when Christianity began, the story of the Christians was that the Jews lost their status as the God's people, or God's chosen nation, because they didn't accept the messianic status of Jesus. And they said that the Jews are now banned and damned, and they're going to be all over the world, and they're going to be miserable. And only if you accept Jesus will you be able to become the new chosen people. This went on for about 400 years. Christianity actually shifted headquarters to Rome. In the beginning, there were two Christian groups, one led by actually Jesus's brother, and the other one was led by other people, and the other group went to Rome, established their headquarters in Rome, and in 336, in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine of Rome accepted Christianity. And when that happened, a whole change in the narrative of the church changed. Up until that time, they only blamed the Jews for not accepting Jesus, but they accepted that the Romans were the ones that crucified Jesus. Once Constantine became Christian and they were in Rome, the story didn't do well with the Romans, that they're the ones that crucified their savior, who they now were believing in. So they changed the story and they said, no, it was actually the Jews that killed Jesus. And from that time on, Christianity has been, part of their narrative has been for 2,000 years that the Jews are damned because they were the ones that crucified Jesus. An early bishop in the Christian church, John Chrysostom, who is very important, he hated the Jews and he had lots of sermons against the Jews. And the reason that he is so important is because he was a very eloquent speaker. And his sermons were copied for centuries by other priests that wanted to be able to have a good sermon. So they looked at, and so all of the things that he taught were being copied by others for hundreds of years. Years later, Martin Luther said, there's no way that the Jews are ever going to convert, because look at what we're saying about them. So we have to have more passionate love for the Jews. But when he did his Reformation, and he expected that the Jews are now going to flock to the Reformation, and they didn't, Luther became very, very upset. He wrote a pamphlet called The Jews and Their Lies, where he began to advocate to all the princes in Germany that they should burn every synagogue, they should not allow the rabbis to teach, they should confiscate all Jewish literature, burn down the synagogues, take away their wealth, assign them to manual labor as a form of penance. Now, if you take a look at Luther's teachings, you will find that the Nazis later on, who, by the way, Kristallnacht was done on Martin Luther's birthday. The Nazis copied lots of the things that Luther advocated in their ideology as well. So then we shift to the Hungarian Jewish experience. Those of you that were in Hungary remember that hot pepper is very symbolic and almost synonymous with Hungary. Paprika is a Hungarian spice. Jews came to Hungary close to 2,000 years ago. They came in the 2nd century with the Roman legions, who had just freshly put down the revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt in Israel, and they took with them lots of Jewish slaves to be able to take care of their needs. And we have found in Hungary cemeteries that all faced east, which was a Jewish custom, and they also found in archaeological digs coins from the Bar Kokhba Israel times. So we know that Jews showed up in Hungary approximately 1800 years ago. So the Hungarians and the Jews never had a very wonderful relationship. They invited the Jews to settle in more and more and more. The Jews were used for commerce. They had cousins and uncles in different countries in the neighboring region. But when the Jews became very prosperous, the Hungarians began to become very jealous and they kicked them out. And because they didn't have the same religious background and they had their own private, separate areas, they were never welcome. And so their love-hate relationship lasted for centuries. In the 1800s, the Jews began to advocate and agitate for equality and emancipation in Hungary. They did many things to ingratiate themselves with the Hungarian rulers. They were very patriotic Hungarians, and the Hungarian monarchy, or the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, began to start looking with favor that they're going to give emancipation and they're going to recognize Judaism as a religion on the same level as Catholicism or Protestantism is going to be a recognized religion. But in 1882, by that time, there was a lot of backlash amongst the clergy and amongst people that didn't like the idea of the Jews getting this kind of recognition. So there were a lot of blood libels. A blood libel, if anybody doesn't know what it is, and I'm sure you all know, is accusing Jews of killing Christian children around Pesach and draining their blood and using them in the baking of matzah. This kind of an accusation it surfaced, I think, in the 1200s for the first time in England. And in Hungary, there was a peasant girl, Esther Somogyi, who disappeared. She lived in a town called Tiszaeszlár, which is next to the river Tisza, which is one of the great rivers of Hungary. She disappeared. Her mother made up a story that the Jews must have killed her because it's near Passover. So there was a big trial and there was a huge amount of outcry. Jews were being killed all over Hungary. And this resonated with the Jews and the non-Jews in Hungary. And it was an experience that was never forgotten. My father was born in an area right near the Tisza River also, not in the same town, but very close by. And when he was born in 1907 and later as he grew up, he kept hearing about the Tiszaeszlár. Today, the political system in Hungary has a very large anti-Semitic party called the Jobbik, the right-wing party. They got about 20% of the popular vote in the last election, and they keep referring to the Tiszaeszlár blood libel, that the Jews are this and the Jews are that. So this is the history of the Hungarian Jewish experience. 1920, Hungary lost the war. They were on the side with the Hungarian Austrian Empire. The Hungarian Austrian Empire was cut up. And very important in Hungary's history, they lost 75% of their territory and they created Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Ukraine. And with the loss of territory, about 33% of the Hungarians found themselves outside of Hungary. My grandfather was one of them, who was now suddenly in Transylvania, which was then part of Romania. So Hungary had a very big problem with it. Trianon humiliated Hungary. To this day, they're very upset about, they want to get back to Greater Hungary. And as the years went, in the 30s, when Hitler came to power, Hitler promised Hungary that if Hungary joins Germany in their war effort, Hitler is going to restore these territories to Hungary. And this was a very important, the majority of the people in Hungary wanted these territories back very passionately. This was like a battle cry to get the territories back, like, don't forget the Alamo, remember the Alamo for us in the United States. Hungary in the interwar years, in the late 30s, began to start promulgating anti-Jewish laws, and these laws prevented the Jews from going to university. More than 6% of the population was not allowed to go, only 6%, because they said the Jews comprise 6% of the Hungarian demographic. They barred Jews from government employ, and they defined Jews as a race rather than a religion. Now, this was very important because Hungarian Jews were by and large, by that time, largely assimilated. The majority of the Jews in Hungary were not religious. So they were mostly assimilated, 90%, and 10% were Hasidic, super religious, and the others were not so religious. And many people in Hungary wanted to get out of the prejudice and anti-Semitism, and they converted to Christianity. But once the government defined Jews as a race, conversion didn't help you anymore. Because even if you converted, your race is going to be the problem. And my mother told me stories of Hungarian Jews who are now Christians, when they had to wear the yellow Star of David, identifying them as Jews, that they would go to church for communion wearing the yellow Star of David. You know, you couldn't escape your fate. Hungary joined the Nazis because, number one, there was a large movement by 1920 and so on. There's a lot of political background. I don't want to go into it, but the Jews were naturally blamed for the loss of the war. And there was a lot of anti-Semitic feelings in Hungary. And the ideology in Hungary was to get rid of the Jews. They had this, what do we do? How do we solve the Jewish question? All the anti-Semites were asking the Jewish question. They're spreading all over the land. They're controlling all of the empire. They're controlling all the banks. They're controlling all the news. Many things that we have been hearing all our lives and all of our history. So Hungary had an age-old desire to get rid of the Jews, and this dovetailed with the German narrative. And basically, Hungary joined Germany in the war effort. Now, I mentioned earlier, when Hungary received from Germany, Romania, Czechoslovakia, areas of Czechoslovakia, there were a lot of Hungarians living there. Suddenly, in 1940, Hungary picked up an extra 200,000+ Jews from these provinces. So the Hungarian Jewish population swelled to close to 800,000, which included about 100,000 Jews who were converted. But now with the new racial laws, they were all considered Jews. Their fate, their destruction happened very, very quickly. In March 19th, 1944, Germany came into Hungary, and their avowed purpose was to get rid of the last bastion of Jewish concentration, which was the Hungarian Jews, 800,000 Jews, and they began to start shipping them away. What they did is they already identified all the Jews because they were wearing yellow stars. In the small provincial towns, all of the non-Jews knew exactly who was a Jew and who wasn't. So they could pinpoint, this is a Jew, this is a Jew. They forced the Jews out of their homes and they put them into ghettos, which were near the train tracks. They kept them in the ghettos for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, depending. And then they were ready to be put onto the wagons and sent to Auschwitz. None of the Hungarian Jews knew what Auschwitz meant, with some exception that the leadership of the Hungarian Jewish community was told about what Auschwitz was. There were eyewitnesses who escaped from Auschwitz, who came and told them what Auschwitz was, but for reasons of their own, they decided not to tell the population. So the Jews went to Auschwitz thinking that they were going to be relocated, they're going to go to a work camp, and as a result, there was no backlash to the Germans. They went like sheep to the slaughter because they thought that they were going someplace where they're just going to be working, and at the end of the war, they're going to come back. The fate of the Jews in Budapest, however, was very different. Again, for various political reasons, after the provincial Jews were all shipped to Auschwitz, the deportation of the Jews stopped in the middle of July of 44. Because of the reports from Auschwitz that were spread by several Jews who escaped from Auschwitz, who drew a blueprint and so on of where the gas chambers were and so on, this report, called the Auschwitz Report, was sent to the Hungarian government, the Swiss government, the British government, the American government, and they began to put out feelers to the government of Hungary that if you continue to kill the Jews, you are going to be considered war criminals at the end of the war. There's going to be a problem. So the Hungarian leader decided to stop the deportation, and they didn't deport mass amount of Jews anymore. So the Budapest Jews, there were about 200,000, escaped this fate. But October the 15th, the government was overthrown, and a virulently crazy anti-Semitic group, they were like the Gestapo in Germany, they were called the Arrow Cross, and they were as bitterly anti-Semitic as any of the Nazis were. They came to power, and they began to try to deport the Jews once again. There were reasons, technical reasons. There were not enough trains where they couldn't deport them. So they began to take 50, 80,000 Jews from Budapest and march them on foot to Vienna. October, November, December, bitter cold. This was a death march, and a vast majority, like 60,000 Jews, died on this march. So, but many Jews were saved due to various efforts of saving the Jews. So let's talk a little bit about my mom. My mom was a very educated woman. She attended high school, which was already unusual for women in Hungary in those days. She graduated from high school in 1930 and immediately enrolled in college. She wanted to be a physician. However, the laws that they enacted said that you cannot be more than 6% of the population of Jews couldn't be doctors, couldn't be lawyers, couldn't be engineers. So she was not allowed to study medicine. So she decided to study education. She was in college where a student group that spread all over Hungary began to start beating up the Jewish students and forced them to not come to classes. My mother, they were beating up boys, they were beating up girls, men, women. So my mother went home and she figured maybe when this all blows over, she'll go back, but she ended up never going back. She was deported to Auschwitz July 1st and arrived there on July 7th, 6 days in a wagon. They put in 2 buckets into the wagon. There were about 100 people crammed into the wagon. One bucket had water in it. The other bucket was for your bodily needs. In the 6-day trip to Auschwitz, by the time they arrived in Auschwitz, they pulled out many, many Jews who died along the way, either because of starvation or because of heart attacks, or some of them committed suicide because they couldn't deal with it. She was liberated about a year later after a death march of her own. So a picture of my grandparents, my mother and her father. Her father was a bank official. He was a head bookkeeper in a bank. He had a good job. He had an education. So my mother always grew up. She attended plays. She was taking part in plays. She had a very, very wonderful and comfortable middle-class existence. My mother read poetry in Greek. She read poetry in Latin. She was a very, very sophisticated young woman. On the other hand, my father, who was born in 1907, he was a semi-orphan. His dad died when he was born, and he had a big family. My mother was an only child. My father had a very large family, and all his family, except for one brother who emigrated to America in 1922, his entire family was all wiped out. The picture, the little baby next to my father was his 14-month-old son. When the Germans came into Hungary in March 19th, there was a big commotion, and my father went up to Budapest. He had a shoe business. He went up to Budapest to see what was going on. When he arrived at the train station, they arrested him immediately. They were looking for Jews. They arrested him. They kept him in a concentration camp in Hungary for 6 weeks, and then they shipped him to Auschwitz, and from Auschwitz, they shipped him to various other Bergen-Belsen. They were all death camps, and some of them were work camps where they didn't kill you, they worked you to death. His baby and his wife, my dad never saw them. They were shipped away 6 weeks later, and he had no chance to, he wasn't on the same train with them. He had no chance to say goodbye to them. You know, he didn't know what happened to them until he was liberated, and he came home to Hungary looking for his wife, looking for his family. And that's when he first began to understand that they're not coming back. So some people say that Auschwitz or the Holocaust never happened. There are deniers. Obviously, the majority of the proof for Auschwitz came from Germans themselves. And the death camp, many of the death camps were blown up by the Germans when they were evacuating and getting out. As the Germans, as the Russians, as the Americans, as the British were coming, they blew up all of the evidence. But they didn't blow up Auschwitz. And for all those people who say it never happened, all you got to do is go to Poland. And you got to go to Auschwitz. And you see in Auschwitz exactly, you know, what happened, and you see the remnants. So Auschwitz stands as a silent memorial that this happened, and it happened there. Now, this picture that I took when on one of my visits shows the tracks that were especially laid by the Germans for the Hungarian Jews. These tracks didn't exist in 43, they did it in 44, and the purpose for the tracks was to bring the Jews closer to the crematorium. If you take a look at this picture, and how do we have this picture, by the way? Who took this picture? These pictures were taken by German photographers, German soldiers. They wanted to memorialize a day and an arrival of the Jews to Auschwitz. And this is part of something called the Auschwitz album, which is an incredible story by itself. And these are actual pictures of Jews that arrived with the packs on their back. And if you look carefully in the back, you see the chimneys on both sides, and they brought them to be able to get them close so they could speed up the time of getting them off the wagons, selecting who they're going to send to the gas chambers, who's going to work, and get it as efficiently as possible. There are Jews walking over here who were already sent, and they're walking on their way to the gas chambers. These are more pictures. And these are, you see a better picture over here of a segment of people that are on their way to the gas chamber. They had no idea where they were going. And this was the first selection where immediately they separated the men and the women. And then they began to, Dr. Mengele, who is very, very well known for his atrocities, he was the one that separated and selected those that he felt were fit for work and those that he didn't. Interesting story. My mother was sent to the left by Mengele. The left was going to the gas chambers. My mother had no idea what the left is, what the right is. Some of her girlfriends that she was on the train with went to the right. As the lines began to move, there was a commotion. A lady began to scream, and she was separated from her family. She made a big commotion, and the Nazi guards went to quiet her. And in the commotion, my mother shifted over to the other line, and she rejoined her friends, which is what saved her life. Otherwise, she also would have been in the same fate as her father, who was killed immediately upon arrival. Now, the recipes from Auschwitz, during my mother's stay, she was in Auschwitz, she was in Birkenau, which was another of the death camps. That was where the pictures I just showed a minute ago was actually in Birkenau, which is a part of the Auschwitz, was called Auschwitz I, and Birkenau was Birkenau II. It was like a sub-camp of Auschwitz. She was there. She also went to another camp called Ravensbrück, and she met these two ladies, among many others. These two ladies were sisters, a very well-known rabbi in Hungary, their daughters, and my mom became very, very friendly with them, and they shared a lot of the recipes, and they stayed together all during their incarceration in Ravensbrück. And when they came home together. And this lady here ended up coming to my father's hometown, and she married a very religious Hasidic Jew who was a good friend of my father. So when she realized that my father's wife was not coming home, she said to my father, listen, I met a girl while I was in Auschwitz, and I think you would like her. So let me invite her. She'll come for a visit and you meet her. So she invited my mother. My mother came for a couple of weeks. She was introduced to my father. They met, and the rest, as they say, is history. My parents got married. But the interesting thing was that their lives up until then were so incredibly different. My father was a Chassid. My father only knew black and white. You're allowed to do this. The Torah allows that. The Torah doesn't allow it. He came from a very large family, from a very poor background. He worked hard. He was an apprentice. He worked hard. He was a hard worker all his life. He became a successful businessman. He married. He had a child. My mother, on the other hand, was a very comfortable young woman. She was very urbane. As I said, she went to plays and so on, a college student. So when they got married, my father told her that the lifestyle of his life will be strictly Orthodox, 100% kosher, Shabbos observing. And my mother decided, you know, I'm going to accept this lifestyle. And she did. And there was never any going back. You know, my mother raised me in a very religious way. I never knew that she was not religious when she was growing up. There was never any evidence for me. So Now, Hungary is now in the process in the last 20 years or so or more of sanitizing their role in the destruction of the Jews. They're not denying that Auschwitz happened. They're not denying that the Jews were shipped out of Hungary and so many died. They're saying it was only the Germans that did it, not the Hungarians. The Hungarians had nothing to do with it. Now, the Arrow Cross that took power in October of 1944 began to round up Jews in Budapest wherever they could find them, walk them over to the Danube River, make them take their shoes off, tie their legs together so they don't have to spend 2 bullets, and they would shoot them and they would fall into the Danube River. And this way they killed tens of thousands of people. Some of the Jews were protected with Swiss or Swedish emigration papers. The Arrow Cross members, when they found Jews, they showed them the papers, they didn't care. They took them and they shot them. So the interesting thing is that many of us last summer were at this memorial and remember this memorial. And if you look at the ground, there are plaques. One is in Hungarian, one is in English, and one is in Hebrew. And the plaques say the identical information that this is a memorial to the victims of the Arrow Cross fascists in the Second World War. There is not one word about the fact that the victims are all Jews. You know, and Hungary has done other memorials to the Holocaust that are all missing the word Jewish victim. So this is, Hungary is doing museums, etc. They're trying to clean up there, and they are denying that they did anything. Basically, it was only the Germans. So my book talks about, in a lot more detail, obviously, about my parents' life. It talks about the Hungarian Jewish experience and about how it happened, in which camp, and how they were shipped away. And I focus on 2 villages or 2 cities. One is my mother's and the other one is my father's. I was born in my father's village, Papa, and I grew up there for the first 10 years of my life. And I need to tell you that the Hungarian Gentiles have not had any recrimination about hating Jews. I got called a dirty Jew many, many times when I was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. So I can't say that there was a lot of things that changed. There's a phenomenal movie called 1945 that if you have a chance, you should see it. It's a Hungarian movie that was made by Hungarian non-Jews, and it talks about, it's in English subtitles, it talks about a Hungarian Jew and his son that come back after Auschwitz, and what happens in the village that they come back to where they used to live, and how the Hungarians basically, I don't want to tell you the story, but it's a very, very powerful. I was shocked when I saw this movie, that this movie was made by Hungarian non-Jews. I was shocked. So that probably took me longer than I wanted to, but if you have any questions, I will be delighted to try to answer them.
So what I'll ask is, if you'd like to ask Alex a question, please feel free to unmute and ask, or if you're more comfortable, if you'd like to type something in the chat box, we can share it from there. Please feel free to ask him about the story he just shared, or the book itself, or his process, or anything that you're wondering.
There are 24 fantastic recipes in the book. My wife made me meticulously write as I was writing a cookbook, and I spent a lot of agonizing time because I knew how to do all of the recipes, but basically I took a pinch of this and a pinch of that, but now I had to write it down. So there are 20, my mother had a lot more than 24 recipes, but I have 24 Hungarian goulash and chicken paprikash and many, many other things. So in addition to a sad story, you also get a chance to take a look at some really good Hungarian recipes.
Dr. Sternberg, am I correct? Some of those recipes were not particularly kosher.
Correct.
I believe there was one that had pepperoni or something like that in its sausage.
Okay.
I guess your mom never made those after she married, huh?
Okay. I believe that every recipe in the book is 100% kosher. But when I talk about sausage, there's kosher sausage. You know, all sausage, there are kosher salamis, there are kosher sausage. We don't have pepperoni pizza, but we have pepperoni on its own and pizza on its own. So my mom was not kosher before the war, before she married my father, but every one of the recipes that she taught me, these are recipes that she learned, and she changed them over into a kosher format. I put in margarine instead of butter, you know, so all of the only thing that I use in the Hungarian goulash that does not have a rabbinical certification, and I checked out the ingredients, and I'm not going to tell anybody who is extremely religious to do what I did, but there is a goulash paste that comes out of something that looks like a toothpaste jar, a toothpaste tube, and it has flavored seasoning that is very, very good for, it's a tomato paste. Now, I found that from Israel, you also have a similar tomato paste that can be used just as easily. I use the Hungarian tomato paste. It's really, there's nothing but natural ingredients in it, so I'm okay with it. You know, but if I make this recipe and I have people coming over who are very religious, I substitute the Israeli product. I don't put it in because I don't want to have anybody else ascribe to my level of understanding of what kosher is.
I promise I won't tell.
Okay, thank you.
I want to tell, that's all. Hey,
Thank
Alex,
you.
I got a question for you. So I
Yes.
didn't go to the European Games last time with you. You and I have been to a lot of games, a lot of stuff together. How did you feel when you went back to Hungary? Was it a long time before you've been there when you went with the games, or do you go there often because of family? How did you feel when you took the delegation there, you and Deb and everybody else? What came out of it for you?
I have to tell you that you're hitting on an exceptionally sensitive nerve.
Well, I would do that to you.
Okay. I have been back in Hungary many, many, many times. I started to go back. I left in 1960. I went back for the first time in 1980. I was invited by the Hungarian Sports Ministry to train the Hungarian karate coaches. And I've been back many times. There have been a lot of karate competitions, international championships in Hungary. And as the US coach, I used to go back and I used to coach the team there and so on. I coached the junior national team and etc. During last year, I went to Hungary twice. Once was to set up the competition and to have a site visit, and the second time to go back. Every time I go to Hungary, I have a certain feeling. Number one, while I wear a kippah, in Hungary I don't. I don't want to get into a fight. And I don't trust the Hungarians that somebody is not going to say something or make a sneer or snide comment, etc. So I wear a hat. I wear a baseball hat, etc. My son, who wears his tzitzis out, he goes to a very, very religious yeshiva. I told him when he came with me, and he's been with me in Hungary. My son speaks Hungarian. I said, you don't wear the tzitzis out. I don't want any problems. A lot of the Hungarians are very anti-Semitic, and a lot of them are not. When I go back to Hungary, I have a warm feeling because I speak the language. It's a culture that I grew up in, and it reminds me of the place where my parents were. So I kind of feel a little bit closer to my parents when I go back to Hungary. But I'm not comfortable there. And oftentimes I've been back and I swore I'm never coming back again. So I have a love-hate relationship. I enjoy reading Hungarian books, Hungarian literature. I got that from my mother. I have friends that are non-Jewish in Hungary that are wonderful, wonderful people. And I appreciate their input. I have two friends that I met who have made a career out of studying the history of Jews. And I asked one of them, why would you do this? You're not Jewish. What do you care what happened to the Jews? I kind of assumed years ago that every Hungarian was an anti-Semite, but it's not true. They're not. But I'll tell you one experience that I had in 2010. I was on my way to Serbia to the World Karate Championships. I had an aunt that was still alive in Hungary at the time, so I stopped off for a few days in Budapest, and from Budapest I went to Serbia. I went to Belgrade. While I was there, it was a weekend, Shabbos. I went to the synagogue, the Kozintsutz Orthodox synagogue. And then afterwards, I went to lunch and so on. And then I had a beautiful October day. And I went walking around pretty much in the same area as we all stayed at, where the Ritz was, all around there. Kind of outside the Ritz, but on an avenue nearby, they were setting up for a big rally of some sort. There were banners across the boulevard and sound speakers, sound stage and everything was being set up. I looked at the banner and I said, oh boy, that's the Your Big Party. Like the Arrow Cross people of today. You know, they don't want to kill the Jews, they want them out of Hungary. So I went walking, I went to the parliament, I went here and there. When I came back, there was a huge rally, tens of thousands of people with speakers. And the speakers were talking about the damn Jews and what the Jews did. And we have to get rid of the gypsies and we have to get rid of the damn Jews. And I was standing there and I was listening to this. And then I think I did get a little smarter as I got older. I said to myself, let me get out of here because I'm afraid that I'm going to end up in some kind of an altercation. And I certainly can't fight 10,000, 20,000 people. Let me get out of here. I'm going to end up getting into trouble. So I left. But obviously, when you see 20,000 people are cheering on a speaker who's talking about killing the Jews or getting rid of the Jews, and what goes on today with George Soros and the anti-Semitic campaign, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of Soros politically, but the Hungarians are using him as the stereotypical Jew who everybody in Hungary has to hate. So when Viktor Orban is running for re-election and he makes a big deal out of ostracizing Soros, he's telling all his followers, vote for me because I have no love for the Jews. So how do I feel when I go back? This book is probably going to be translated into Hungarian. There's a Hungarian lady that is talking with me. She wants to translate it. I have a feeling that once the book is translated, I better not go back to Hungary because the book talks a lot about very, very accurately, historically. I did a lot of research on the book. The book tells the story of how the Hungarian Christians killed the Jews. And that's as simple. Now, again, my mother had a friend in her hometown who was a Catholic lady. She was the best friend of my mom. She took some of my mom's possessions and hid them during the war. She got into trouble. She was my mother's best friend, but my mother had a yellow star on her. She was walking with her and she linked her arm with my mom. And my mom said to her, what's the matter with you? You're going to get into trouble. Don't walk with me. You know, because all the Jews were being ostracized. And this lady said to my mother, this is the way we walked yesterday. This is the way we'll walk today. And this is the way we're going to walk tomorrow. So there were people that were very, very decent. Unfortunately, Yad Vashem doesn't have a huge, huge section for righteous Gentiles who come from Hungary. There were more in Poland. There were more in Russia who saved Jews, less in Hungary. So that I have a lot of ambivalent feelings about being back in the country. However, especially since I've been researching this book, I've become very knowledgeable and familiar with Hungarian Jewish history. So now I feel very comfortable in taking the group that we did and talking to everybody and giving them history about what happened and this happened here and this happened there. You know, so I'm actually looking forward to the possibility that I may be able to lead groups to Hungary, you know, Jewish groups, and to take them on a tour of the Hungarian Jewish experience.
Thank you, Alex.
So Alex, Janet has a question in the chat. Janet Silver asks, seems it would be very difficult for starving prisoners to discuss food. How did they make that mental compartmentalization?
Another phenomenally good question, Janet. Thank you very much for the question. In my research, I found there was an interesting research bit that I learned in America. During the Second World War, there were a group of American conscientious objectors that did not want to go into the army. So one of the projects that the United States government offered them to do in lieu of going into the army was to starve them. to see how little calories they could get by with, if they were starved in a prisoner of war camp, etc. So these Americans were starved in a very low calorie diet, and they began, as they were starving, the more they were starving, the more they became obsessed with talking about food. And the same thing happened to my mother and to the other ladies. They were starving. They had no food. If I describe to you the things that they were given to eat, it certainly would disgust you. And there wasn't enough of it. My mother told me that she couldn't, there was a soup that she got on lunchtime that had junk in it, crap in it, all kinds of, a clump of grass. And she said that it smelled so bad that she couldn't drink it. And other people who were there already, who were veterans in Auschwitz, who were there for a week or 2 weeks, told my mother, if you don't drink it, you're gonna die. Hold your nose and swallow it, because it's the only thing between you and death is going to be whatever nourishment you get. So they were starving, but they were fascinated with talking because they were starving. They were talking about food, and many other people have written about their experiences in Auschwitz, being fascinated with recipes. Mine is not the only book that talks about it. I think perhaps mine is the only one that has a collection of recipes that were collected in Auschwitz. You know, but there are other people that talk about cooking in Auschwitz and talking about recipes.
Yeah, there's another. So,
Oh, I have a question. Well,
yeah,
sort of.
please.
We were watching a news show about a month ago. I don't remember if it was 60 Minutes or something like that. And they did talk about the government now in Hungary. My grandfather's from Hungary, and they fled in the early 1920s.
Right.
Just before my grandfather was born. There were like 9 kids, and 2 were born in the US, and my uncle one of them. And I can't believe they did it. But so the thing is that they, my husband and I watched this news show that they were talking about the government now in Hungary, and the anti-Semitic that you were talking about. And they were talking about the cleansing, and they used that term, of anyone that wasn't a pure Hungarian. And they are paying people to get pregnant and marry pure Hungarians. And that was pretty frightening, that to hear that the, I don't know if he's a president or prime minister.
Prime Minister.
I don't remember that. And that was pretty scary, being that my bloodline is a Hungarian Jew.
Right.
And knowing that they're paying people to get married and have babies that are pure of blood and not Jewish and not of any other faiths and stuff. That was pretty scary, because it reminded me of World War II and the whole purification of human beings. That was pretty scary to watch.
Well, I would suggest that you do not volunteer to sire any of these children. I don't think you'll make it.
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm too old. Yeah. But,
Viktor Orban is the Prime Minister
Yeah.
of Hungary. And he's a very interesting character. I wrote an article that appeared in the Jerusalem Post a couple of years ago. Is Viktor Orban an anti-Semite? I don't know if he is, and I have no reason to believe that he is, but
yeah.
during his reign, during his prime ministership, he has been cleaning a lot of the Hungarian Nazis who were pushed into the background, and suddenly schools are being named after them, boulevards are being named after them, statues are being named after them, and he is very, very, on the other hand, his climate, his constituency, you know, it's always kind of in a veiled or double entendre. This is what we mean, but we really, everybody knows we're talking about the Jews. At the same time, Hungary is the most loyal and dedicated partner to Israel in the European Union.
Wow.
The European Union, read about it now. The European Union has
Okay.
just announced that if Israel annexes the Jordan Valley that they're talking about annexing, the European Union is going to go crazy. They're going to have all kinds of sanctions, and they wanted to pass this resolution. Hungary vetoed it.
But what I found interesting in this whole show was that my son, we went to Berlin with Maccabi, and it was the most amazing experience of my life to be able to take the tours. And to all of our tour guides were Jewish, and they came from like Israel, and they're moving back to Berlin,
Right.
Jews, and because of their ancestors and stuff. Whereas here, you know, I felt it really did something to me to be in Berlin and go to the railroad tracks the first day and everything. And I really believe it changed my son and my life to be there, even though my family wasn't from there, but my people were from there.
You know,
And then to hear where my people came from, and they haven't evolved per se, their mindset.
it's not evolved. The difference between Germany and Hungary is very, very significant. The
That's what I'm seeing.
The Germans accepted their role in the destruction of 6 million people. They asked for forgiveness.
Yes.
They paid
Yes.
reparations. They owned up to what they did. They didn't deny.
Yes.
Hungary
Right.
denies it to this day. They do not
Yeah.
accept the responsibility for what they did. And
I get it. I see what you're saying now. Yeah. Yeah.
the Germans are a new Germany. You know, I have to say that
Yeah.
when I hear German, I speak German. When I hear German, I lived in Vienna for a year. When I hear German, it definitely, my blood pressure goes up. You know, I'm not comfortable. I could not do it. I just recently saw a movie that maybe some of you or many of you have seen called Unorthodox.
Yes. Yes.
And she
On
actually,
Netflix.
in real life, she moved to Germany. I can't understand how a Jew, but there is a couple of 100,000 Jews from Russia, from the old Soviet Union, from Israel that are living in Germany. And
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Deborah.
Yeah,
I think we have
no
time
problem.
for one last short question, and from Alex, a short answer, please. And then we'll move on. So, Harold, did you texted?
Yeah, I had a question because I read your book, and then I'm in the process of reading the Warburgs from Germany. And it seems to me, the impression I get the minute we start getting to this total assimilation, people kind of forget where they're from. And with the conversions going on, with the intermarriage, and just the walk away from religion, that pretty much doomed a lot of the Jewish populations through Europe. And it's kind of being mirrored today in the US. And that kind of concerns me. What are your thoughts on that? And I know you don't have a lot of time.
I will make it very brief. Hungarian Jews put their faith in their assimilation into Hungarian society. They were very Hungarian. They were very proud to be Hungarian. And they thought that because of the fact that they considered themselves to be Hungarian, they would have no problem. And they would escape without any major problems. What ended up happening was that they were shocked when they were pushed into the wagons along with the Hasidic Jew with the long payas and the beard, because to the Hungarians, it didn't make any difference whether you give up your religion or you didn't. So Hungarian assimilation actually might have aided the destruction, because they were, you want to leave Hungary to go where? There were no Zionism. Zionist movements were very, very meager in Hungary. They had no interest in becoming Zionists. They liked Hungary. They wanted to be in Hungary. So I agree with you. I think that it may very well have doomed the Hungarian Jews because of their love for Hungary, and that love was not reciprocated by the Hungarians.
So thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we've reached the end. If anybody has other questions or comments for Alex, please feel free to send them to me. I will share them with him and get you answers and responses. Just a few points I want to share. Our next book club meeting is coming up in a few weeks, and we're doing this book here. It's called Palestine Posts. It's an eyewitness account of the birth of Israel. Again, the author will be joining us to share the story. It's essentially his father's story from the founding of Israel. So please go to our website, take a look, get the book, read it, join us. It'll be fascinating.